Well, hi again. In this program, we're going to take a short trip down memory lane. And memory lane meaning my flying career over I've been in aviation roughly 80 years now, when I totaled everything up. And it started out at the Akron Airport, Akron Municipal Airport, and there was two barnstormers came in. Clarence Chamberlain came in with his Curtis Condor, which was a biplane, meaning it had two wings and two engines, which was a real rarity and it's never happened again. Anyway, that was my first airplane ride. It cost 50 cents. And this airplane, when the engine started, even when it flew, was a perfect example of shake, rattle, and roll. My dad was terrified that we weren't going to come back. It carried about 12 people, but it was the first airliner in the history of aviation. Then it became, from the Ford Tri-Motor took over, had three engines, and then the Boeing 247 came over, then the DC-2 and the DC-3. And the DC-3 really took over as a fast airplane, low wing, and all the airlines bought it. It made Douglas Aviation, but they built about 12,000 of them, and they became the C-47 during the war. And after the war, they converted them back to DC-3s, which was basically changing the engines and the brakes and all that. And at 12,000, then they dwindled, but there's still about 1,200 of them still flying around the world. They're very good airplanes. In fact, there's an outfit up in Michigan that put jet engines on them, turboprop engines, a propeller with a jet engine driving a propeller. And there was one down at just a short ways down here, where there's an outfit called Preferred Air Parts. And they were converting these DC-3s, taking the old piston engines off and putting on the turboprop engines. Unfortunately, the man who ran the program and was actually one of the founders of Preferred Air Parts, he was taking off, and they haven't come up with the reason for the accident, but he crashed when he was heading over to Akron, Canton. And I started flying when I was 14 years old, but went into the military. First I was in the civilian pilot training program. I joined when I was 16, got some training. Then they found out I wasn't 18 years old, I got kicked out of that. Then from there, I kept trying to get into the Air Force as an aviation cadet. And I had about 3 times where I tried to get in, and they turned me down when they found out my real age. I was 16 years old. I was telling them I was 18 years old. And so I'd already gone to all the recruiting officers here in Akron, so I had to go down to Dayton to enlist. Well, I finally convinced them I was 18 years old. I went into pilot training up in Michigan. In fact, that's the first time I soloed an airplane. And from there, I went went to basic training in Miami. In the summer, 100-degree heat and 100-degree temperatures everywhere. We had to march continually. We couldn't walk any place. We had to march. And we were so miserable marching in the heat, you're just covered with sweat continually. And so the military, the Air Force our Air Corps at that time, came up with the idea of making us sing. Because when you sing, you feel better, they thought. But that was a bad time down there in that heat. Then we went up to Michigan, to Albion College, and took some training up there at Jackson Field. And then from there, we went down to Texas and started the ground school and started the flight training, basic flight training. And I got probably about halfway through that. They found out I just turned 17 then, but you had to be 18 to become an officer and a gentleman. Well, you had to be 18 to get into the program, so that by the time you finished, you were 19, and you became an officer and a gentleman. Well, the colonel called me in when they found out I was only 17, just turned 17, and he said, "You're okay to be a pilot, but you're too young to be an officer and a gentleman." But he says, "Now, what we're going to do," and he had about 50 cadets in this room where he's talking, and at that time they had 250,000 applicants and people that were qualified to go to flight school, become military. Everybody wanted to be a fighter pilot, wanted to be a hero. And so they had to cut back because they lacked training room. So they cut back, and I was part of the cutback. And he says, "We're going to send you to a good job we got for you, a good assignment in the Air Corps." And I says, "Well, why the big hurry?" Because he said, "We have an airplane waiting at the airport to take 50 of you guys out to a gunnery school in Arizona." I said, "Gunnery school?" I said, "Colonel, why the rush?" He said, "We're losing a lot of people out there and we need gunners." "Well, thank you much, Colonel." So that's where I spent my military time out in the Marianas Islands as a gunner on a B-29. And that's another story, and it's a long story. I was out there for well over a year, and we actually had burned down every city in Japan. And when I came back, I decided to continue. Well, I went to the University of Akron. Then I got commissioned as second lieutenant. After I graduated in 1950, I went into pilot. I was recalled into Korea and went into pilot training again. And I had an injury in World War II. So they took me off of pilot training, and I went to a civilian. I had to leave the military then because of the injuries. I got medical out. And then I went to an airline, best way to describe it, an airline pilot school up in Boston for Northeast Airlines to become an airline pilot. And I flew for a while for a small outfit there and came back and got hired by Eastern Airlines. And then from there, I got laid off. Well, Eastern Airlines was having a tough time that summer, so we got started, got into flight training, and then got laid off from Eastern Airlines. Then I went with Capital Airlines and got hired there, was in training again in this C-47 or the DC-3, and got laid off because United Airlines in 1955 absorbed Capital Airlines. So I came back here to Akron, and I thought, I'll just start my own flying business. The airline business, the flying business was bad those days. So I started my own flying business, and it seems like I hit it lucky right at the right time. And this is a picture of some of the airplanes I had. At one time, I was up to about 50 airplanes, including training airplanes, charter airplanes, C-45s, I had a C-47. And this was taken at the ramp at the Akron Municipal Airport. So the business kept growing and growing and growing, and finally wound up, as I mentioned, with 50 airplanes. And over the course of the time, about 30 pilots. We also had, hit it lucky again. I went to the ROTC, Army and Air Force at Akron U and at Kent State. And we got the contracts to train the ROTC pilots. That lasted for a while until the Akron U and at Kent State, they started their own program. But here's something I would like to show you. The B-29. And I give a talk called The B-29 Goes to War. This is the airplane I was on. I was what they call a Central Fire Control Gunner, which was in a blister. Right here, the guns, the turrets, were out, and the guns were not inside the airplane. They were outside, and the gunner controlled the turrets electronically, just like in the Navy, where they have a big cannon out here, and then they have a man sitting in an enclosed area moving the guns around. The B-29 is a beautiful airplane, but it was way ahead of its time, and the airframe was pressurized, a very comfortable airplane to ride in. And of course, there's a lot of press and a lot of claims for the airplane. Claimed it could cruise at 280 miles an hour. That was straight down with nothing in it. Anyway, my position was up here. And I survived it, although I did have a little accident in Nebraska. When I came out, got into my own business, and I showed you the. Then I had a C-47, and this is what it looked like. I bought a C-47 for $12,000, and this is what it looked like. And I was getting it ready to put on a certificate, but the big airlines didn't want any competition then. So they sued and would not get me, let the FAA issue a certificate for me. And so the airplane was useless to me. So this was in the early 70s, 1970. And the airplane, I couldn't use it. So I decided to sell it, and I sold it to a guy by the name of Gordon Hamilton, at a Hamilton Aircraft in Tucson, Arizona. Now he converted, at that time he was converting C-47s and DC-3s to gunships to be used in, this is the first instance of using gunships. And they took and they modified the airplane, and they put machine guns inside the airplane on each side, and the pilot could control them. So that became the gunship, and this is what mine looked like. They sent me a picture after they converted it, and it was called Old Spooky. And that was the call sign, Spooky, because it would sneak up and go out at night, and then these guns would lay down a field of fire that would cover an acre. And they were just deadly. So they aged, and then after the war, they came up with a C-119, which they made another gunship. And you remember the phrase, a lot of you older people, puff the magic dragon? Well, that's what they called Old Spooky. Puff the magic dragon would sneak up, and the firepower was just tremendous. The pilot actually shot the guns. And then they came up with the C-119, a little bit a more modern airplane, faster, bigger, and that was the gunship used. Then now they use the C-130, which was a huge cargo airplane, 4-engine turboprop from Lockheed, and that became the Spooky of the times. Then we flew so much for General Motors, and we had a scheduled situation set up out of Youngstown, hauling battery cables and ignition harnesses up into the assembly plants. We flew every night. And this was the first commuter airline here in the Ohio or the northeast area of Ohio. And that was a lot of fun, but a lot of work. And that lasted until the GM went on strike, and the truck strike in 1968. So then I decided it's best just to fly charter. And then over the years, I bought a lot of airplanes. We flew charter, we sold airplanes. And then I decided that I've had enough. The requirements became too strict. The FAA was on everybody all the time. Everything was changing. So then I retired from flying after about 31,000 hours. And years of flying, being around airplanes, but I still stayed in airplanes, with airplanes, and we were selling technical manuals under ESSCO Incorporated. ESSCO was my initials, Ernest Stephen Stadvig. And it's still in existence today, but it's a family business. My son owns it, my daughter runs it, and it's still a thriving business down in Barberton, downtown Barberton. ESSCO Incorporated. So we buy and sell manuals. We sell World War II manuals. They go right out the door. We have just about every airplane ever built. A manual for the pilots, a manual for parts, manual for maintenance. And then what I've gone into is I've been giving talks. I've been asked to give some talks. I thought, well, this will be a lot of fun during retirement. So I have given many, many talks. And also, we've got this program. We had a TV program on the Akron, Cleveland TV channel, Time Warner. We have about 12 stations on that. And then when they changed the format, we lost a lot of stations, so decided to go on YouTube, which we are on now. But my hobby now is still doing talks. And I've just given one talk down at Wayne College called The American Soldier. And then that's for the ROTC. I did an ROTC talk at the University of Akron at the 100th anniversary. I've given the title of the talk, this particular talk was called The American Soldier. And it's been very popular. I've gotten a lot of good reviews on this, not on me, but on the story itself about the American soldier. But over the years, I've given talks at the Air Force Base in Youngstown, the Air Force Base in Columbus, and on Veterans Day was up at the MGM Casino. Just briefly, I gave a few words up there, but then I've given talks to Kiwanis clubs, Optimist clubs, schools, anybody who wants to talk about airplanes or the war or whatever, and about my experiences. And it's been a lot of fun. And I still, if you need a speaker, I am available. And I schedule them ahead, and they're either 20 minutes or half an hour, or if you want a longer talk. And the favorite talk has been whatever happened to Amelia Earhart. And I got real interested in this when I bought an airplane, an old Lockheed 12A Electric. And I didn't know the genealogy on that airplane. It was a wonderful airplane. Then a guy came in from Cleveland, and he was a detective, he later told me. And I says, John, what are you doing here? You just didn't come in to talk with me. He says, I want to get pictures of you, Lockheed. I said, why? I don't find that funny stuff. We're legitimate. He said, no, I'm not here for that. He says, I want to get pictures of your airplane because an airplane like yours was found on Saipan Island in 1945. That was Amelia Earhart's airplane. And he gave me the whole story that my airplane and Amelia Earhart's airplane were built in 1935. My serial number was 2 numbers away from hers. My airplane was a Lockheed 12A, and her airplane was a Lockheed 10E. And I've got all the manuals and everything on those airplanes. And my airplane takeoff weight was 8,400 pounds. Her takeoff weight was 17,000 pounds. So right away I knew there was a cover-up. That was the tip-off, that the government was covering up what her mission was about. And she was actually, the government gave her $80,000. They paid Lockheed $80,000 to buy her an airplane in 1937, in the depths of the worst depression we've ever had. Now, why would the United States government give a civilian $80,000 unless they wanted something different? Well, the whole sum of the story, it takes a while to get the thing in, but the thing was that she was on a spy mission, period. For the United States government, it was the worst planned and most blundered spy mission in history. All the Pan Am pilots, I'm sure all the experienced military pilots had to bite their tongues when the government announced that she was lost flying around the world. Well, she was not. She landed on Saipan Island in 1945. Then when I got looking into it, I was on Saipan Island in 1949 at the Aslito Airport, the biggest Japanese military airport in the Pacific. Also, on Saipan Island, there's a place called Tanapag Harbor, and there's a huge beach there. And incidentally, in 1937, that's only, 4 years away from Pearl Harbor. But the Japanese immediately, they took over everything. In fact, they thought that they claimed that Hawaii was part of the Japanese Empire. So the attack on Pearl Harbor was staged out of Saipan Island in 1937. A lot of people don't know that. So my son and I, in 1998, went to Saipan. And we went to Tanapag Harbor and looked at the beach. And you could land a 747 on that beach. And that's where she landed, claiming she's out of gas, which was not true. She carried 1,000 gallons of gas. At 6 pounds a gallon, that meant the gas alone weighed 6,000 pounds. So she had to have a special built airplane. And the government provided that to her, but they've covered this up for years. And when I was we landed on Saipan Island, we were heading over to Tinian Island, because Tinian Island was not secure yet, there was fighting. We stayed there a couple of days, and I asked a couple of Marines, you guys are supposed to be out fighting, what do you guard that big hangar for? And because the rest of your guys are up there fighting in the hills. They said there's something in that hangar that we're never allowed to see or know. They had Marine guards all the way around that hangar. Then later on, when I realized, I started going into the history of this whole thing, that I was on Saipan in 1945 and I saw that hangar. And later, I got word from a Sergeant Devine who was investigating this whole thing, and he said that he was allowed to look in that hangar by a friend of his, and the friend, he opened the door, showed him, he said the airplane, he described the airplane in detail, which nobody else ever has, and it was Amelia Earhart's airplane. And when he asked the guard, what is it, whose airplane? He says, Amelia Earhart's. And this guy said at that time he didn't know about anything, so he said, who's Amelia Earhart? And he says, the Marine told him, don't ever tell anybody I let you look into that hangar, because that is a super secret thing. Later on, when they found out, our government found out that she was captured she landed on Saipan Island, got out of the airplane, and there were hundreds of natives that are indigenous to the islands. And they were working for the Japanese military. And they saw the airplane land, and they made statements that the airplane landed on Saipan Island. And they made statements that a tall woman got out, tall blonde-haired, well, not exactly blonde, but the light-haired woman got out, and a tall man. So it was Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Noonan, got out of the airplane. The commander, the Japanese commander of Saipan Island said, well, she said, I'm Amelia Earhart. He says, we know who you are and why you're here. Anyway, the sum and total was that they were captured then by the Japanese and never heard of again. Now that's one of the stories I have. It takes about an hour really to tell the whole story in detail. But my airplane was 2 serial numbers away from hers. And that was something and I give the talk on that. Then I have another one. I talk about the B-29 gone to war. My experiences in this B-29 on Tinian Island in the air offensive against Japan. We were firebombing Japan, which we didn't particularly care to do that, but we were ordered to do it. And at one time there's something like 2,500 B-29 bombers based on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian Island. And some of the other talks talked about I talk about rather, and some of them are PowerPoint. And one of them was an airport I used to go into in Florida, Fort Lauderdale. And there's a place across from the terminal building that was called Cockroach Corner. And this meant there's a bunch of old World War II airplanes there. It's kind of a junkyard, in other words. But it also is kind of a headquarters for guys that were flying airplanes illegally. They're flying down into South America. At that time, they weren't hauling drugs. They were just smuggling. They're smuggling meat, electronics, weapons, ammunition, bought everything at night. And I used to like to go there. I'd get a ride from the terminal building by the guys in the gas truck. They'd leave me off there, then they'd come back, and the place was very quiet. And there must have been over 100 airplanes in various stages of wrecked and pieces and all that, but there were some airplanes there like B-24s, B-25, and C-47s that were still flyable. When I would walk through, just gazing, looking, the place was very quiet, but I knew there were people watching. And this outfit, the airline pilots, corporate pilots, and the politicians called it Cockroach Corner back there because these guys were all flying illegally into South America. Not drugs, but as I mentioned, stuff that had high tariffs on them when they went through customs. So people down there were hiring these guys. But every so often the feds, the FAA would make an inspection there. But the fellows that drove the gas trucks would always tip off the people at Cockroach Corner that the feds were coming over. And they had everything prepared. They had all their records, their money, everything in bags. When the feds would show up, everybody disappeared out the back doors and go into the mangrove swamps until the feds left. The feds only checked during the day because in those days they never worked at night. They didn't want to get into any problems, and the feds were so many retired military people running the FAA as agents and whatever that they were afraid of. They didn't want to work. They were retired from the military, so they just wanted to do the minimum to get by. They hated paperwork, and they didn't want to start cases or anything, so they never went there at night when these airplanes were fired up, trucks came in. Everybody knew what was happening. These airplanes were loaded, and off they went to South America, and they came back again. That was one of my favorite places to go in there and look at. And over the years, I've come up with many of these talks, and one of them was when I was almost a hero. But I'll get into that one next week. Thank you for being with us.